Hey, good morning, guys. Today we're going to take a look at the first introduction to sensation and perception. Now, what we've really focused on up to this point in the class has really been around about the psychological, more the biological functions of the brain, and not necessarily how we interpret the information and the stimuluses that we incur on a daily basis, and even if we want to go even more microscopic, on a second-to-second basis. Now, we've mentioned a few different times, their average human is going to somehow encompass or have to process nearly 10,000 pieces of information per second when it comes to the five major senses. So it's more than just simply the things that we are aware of. There is a portion, and a large portion at that, of our brain that is constantly processing that information that is at all points in times coming from all directions. So typically when we think about sensation perception, the first main sense that we come to is the idea of vision. So we're going to talk a little bit about optical illusions, and we'll talk a little bit about how we see a certain image for what it is, for what we may have an experience based off of, and any number of different circumstances. But we don't want to just simply rely on one of those perceptions. We want to be able to encompass all of the information through the five senses to make the best and the most logical answer when we're taking a look at things. So, for instance, in some of these things that we're looking at, for some of you, the first, glance at that first picture, you see two faces. For some of you may see a candlestick. Either one is correct. It's just how your brain processes either the near ground or the foreground first. So using vision, that's kind of going to be our jumping off point. Same idea here. Some of you see, the man with the funny nose and a saxophone. Some of you see kind of what looks like maybe like a shadowy figure, a silhouette of a young lady. All right. Or when we get into some of the more linguistic things, for some of you, you see kind of that almost like a black and white picture, almost like a negative of a man's face. But for some of you that are more linguistic, you might see the word liar, all right, which is actually a specific type of linguistic type of perception. And we'll talk more about that in a later section. All right, and each one of these just kind of deals with how your eyes process the information and then make sense of it based off of your previous experiences and also some of the learned traits that you have. So when we look at sensation, we're basically looking at how the pieces of your brain as well as the outward sensory receptors are transmitting and then being able to use that information for some sort of vital central nervous system function. Now, we have the five basic sensations of taste, smell, hearing, vision, and touch. But we're starting to get to the point now where we're almost getting to these pseudo senses and these combination senses where we get things like kinesthetics, where we have the ability for, balance and body positioning, as well as the vestibular sense that we'll talk about when we get into the sense of hearing. It allows us to have that equilibrium, but also incorporate some of the other combinations of sensations that then allow us to have better understanding of the world around us. Now, we have receptors all over the body, whether it's the touch sensors that are pretty much encompassing all of your epidermis, your skin across the body, right, or things that are going to be more, we'll say, sensitive, things like hearing, things like maybe your eyes, your ears, as well as the taste buds in your tongue that are connected to the olfactory nerve that is also incorporating the sensation of smell. All right, so when we look at perception, it's just simply the process that your brain individually goes through to interpret that sensory stimulation. No two humans perceive things the exact same way. All right. Obviously, we're trying to make meaning of the sensations to put them in some sort of logical order, all right, but it reflects all of your previous experiences, learning, attitude, expectations, all of those things go into it, as well as some of the environmental concerns, things that we're going to talk about, the absolute threshold, the difference threshold, what is your relationship to the stimulus. All of those different things play a role in not only how your brain perceives it, but then how you then, taking steps forward, act upon it. So obviously this is going to be extremely confusing because this is really making each individual take a step back and really kind of think about why you see, feel, and touch things the way you do. Right? Is it based off of how you're seeing it at that point in time, Or is your brain making a logical kind of fill in the blank type of Mad Lib that then allows you to kind of make sense of something that normally the human mind should not be able to? All right, that second part is going to sound very, very kind of over the top, a little bit kind of scary gray area like. This entire chapter is going to have that type of feeling to it, because these are things that each individual wise we interpret, but we don't necessarily do a great job of being able to communicate how we're actually feeling, because we don't necessarily have the right language abilities, right, or the right, I guess, conceptual knowledge to fully encompass exactly how we feel, exactly what we're seeing, right? We're using kind of almost like categorical language to try and make sense to others. So the first thing we'll talk about here is the absolute threshold. Most of you did a pretty good job on our previous lessons, little video clip. All right, when we're talking about the absolute threshold, this is just simply the weakest amount of stimulation that you can sense, at least 50% of the time. All right. Now, if any of you have ever had hearing tests, which all of us at some point in time have had a hearing test, right? When they do kind of those hearing tests and they try and get you to react to a certain beep or a certain tone or maybe a certain vibration, they're not looking for you to get it right every single time. When they score you, they're scoring you based off of, did you at least get the thing right 50% of the time? All right, because that allows us to almost like create a threshold or a differentiation between what you truly are able to conceive, right, and perceive, as well as, right, what are kind of some of the outliers. All right, so for instance, when it's dealing with vision, right, and all of these are going to be within what we would kind of consider a vacuum. All right, vision, you should be able to see a candle flame at least 30 miles away, right, with no obstructions. Now, none of us have ever been in a situation where we're in flat ground with no other, sources of light or anything else to distract us, right, where we're going to be able to see that. But on average, that's what the human eye should be able, right, to be able to register. Now, all of our eyes are going to have different focus points. All of us are going to have different foci, as well as different eye shapes that then cause our vision to be either a little more acute or obviously not so acute. All right, same thing with our hearing, same thing with our taste, our smell, all right, our touch. All of them are going to be very, very unique within a vacuum, but in reality, very seldom are we ever going to be put in a situation where we have those average, we'll say adult human thresholds. So, in reality, all right, can we hear, maybe a clock ticking from across the room? That might be a logistical thing. We might also look at, when you do a vision test, and they ask you to, read off the letters of a specific line. All right, sure, yeah, we can read it. All right, but how much of it is practice versus how much of it is, repetition versus did we actually clearly, all right, see that? Or is our brain, because of the limited amount of information that we have, is the brain able to fill in the gaps? For instance, maybe you don't really see the letter H, all right, but your brain knows enough of the outside stimulus and the outside information around it that it can then fill in the blanks for you, kind of like almost like a mental blind spot. Now, the difference threshold is a little bit more acute, a little bit more unique, all right, but it just simply kind of boils down to the minimum amount of difference that you can detect between two very similar stimuluses. All right, we often see this a lot with shading, colors, lighting. All of those things are going to obviously be unique. Each and every human being's difference threshold is going to be different. All right, so sometimes it's the background, sometimes it's the foreground, sometimes it's our positioning, sometimes it's just the relative stimuluses around us that then allow us to kind of have a moving target when it comes to the difference threshold. Right? Typically, we see this a lot more with optics. When you're in an art class and they talk about the color wheel, sure, we understand the association between those two opposite colors, but we don't often think about the difference because of shading. Right? Everything that an art teacher tries to teach you with cross-hatching or any type of shading to give depth to a picture, it's dealing with a person's difference threshold. You are creating a more defined difference threshold for the viewer. That's really kind of what it's dealing with. So yes, your art obviously has a connection to psychology. The signal detection theory, same basic idea, right? It's the ability for us to detect the stimulus, but then we also naturally can increase the stimulation, meaning, all right, we can actually control the intensity of that stimulation. This is the thing, all right, that puts you on edge when you try and turn the lights out and run up the stairs before the monster gets you out of the basement. This is the same thing that also makes you hear noises that may not necessarily always be there. All right. This is all about the general physical and psychological state of the individual. And then as it proceeds, right, then your mind starts to not necessarily manufacture certain types of stimuluses, all right, but you basically have kind of like a residual effect from previous experiences that your brain kind of puts out into the open. All right, so it's not necessarily that there's a physical stimulus out there, but it's kind of like almost like a deja vu type of psychological state, right? Where because you're at a heightened sense, your brain detects something that's not really there. All right, and then lastly, we get to kind of the sensory adaptation. This is really unique, and this is really something that all of us can associate with. For instance, the things that we typically talk about when we deal with sensory adaptation deals with the power or the sensation of scent, right? A lot of us work part-time jobs or have worked part-time jobs in the food industry. Right? Many of us become, quote unquote, nose deaf, right, to some of the senses and some of the smells that may be fairly regular at a place, right? So I put the Subway logo, right? Individuals that work in fast food can all kind of associate with this, right? If you've been cooking the fries all day long for the last 5 days, right, by day 4, day 5, you don't necessarily perceive the fry smell because your brain has already processed that information that it's no longer needed or important. But that doesn't mean the people around you don't smell the fry sensation or the fry grease or whatever it may be when you go to a new environment because they haven't been exposed to that in such large quantities as you have. So even though you may not smell it, other people clearly do because they're going to have a more heightened stimulation to it. All right, same idea happens as our eyes adjust to like light. All right, when we're in a dark room and somebody flips the light on, our eyes have to adjust. All right, so this is all about kind of how we can adapt to our surroundings. Now, it's a little easier for us to perceive when we're talking about going from a lighted room to a dark room. Your eyes adjust to the limit of light in the room. All right, and they do so by the physical muscle reaction, right, inside the eyeballs. Basically, this is looking at the retinas and also the pupils. All right, that's how your pupil opens up when there's less light because it has to allow more light in, and then it shrinks when there's more stimulation and it doesn't need to. All right, so for instance, when it's really, really sunny, all right, you may have pinpoint pupils. All right, when it's extremely dark, your pupils are going to be wide open. They might be the size of a quarter, something like that. Now, we're not going to attribute any of this to certain types of drugs and alcohol. Right, altered states of consciousness. We'll talk about that at another time, but that is something that it is impacted by certain substances. Sensory adaptation is something that will be impacted. All right, so that's kind of all for today. What I do want you guys to do as we're moving forward is I want you to at least take a look at the Section 2 notes dealing with vision. We're going to be heavy into the biology early, dealing with parts of the eye, dealing with how the eye processes color as well as certain motion. So we're talking rods and cones, right? And we'll deal with some of those things that were brought up in the John Green clip, dealing with certain syndromes as well as theories. All right, so I want you guys to at least have the basis before we go into our next one, because the next one is going to deal with a little bit more, we'll say, upper level conversations when it comes to theories of vision. All right, other than that, have a great weekend, guys. And I will reach back out to you guys sometime early next week. All right. Thank you.